In this mini lecture, we're going to cover the concept of federalism. And this is a big deal because federalism is actually what both makes the American political system as unique as it is and makes it one of the most complex systems, both for voters and for people and for understanding that there are. Because federalism creates two levels, if you will, of government, such that even here at Daytona State, we actually offer multiple classes, right? This one is American federal government, but we also offer state and local politics. So we've actually even, an intro level at DSC, we've even broken this up into two things, and that's due to this concept of federalism, which we're going to be talking about today. Federalism, according to Ken Coleman, a famous political scientist, is, quote, federalism can be defined as a political system that includes multiple levels of government, where at least one level has constitutionally protected status. In other words, that means that in our case, we're going to have a national government or a federal government, and we're going to have state governments. And state governments are part of our constitutional framework, meaning they have this constitutionally protected status. Both get to exist. Now, the purpose of all of this, and we're going to see this kind of goes along with what we've already been talking about, is this idea that all of the framers had about dividing power. Divide power, divide power, divide power. Why? Well, you divide power to prevent tyranny, as we've now seen and we've read about. And so the idea is that not only do you divide the power of the federal government into different branches, like the presidency and Congress and the courts, and as a matter of fact, this is what we're going to be taking a look at next in our middle section of the class, but we also need to separate power between the federal government and state governments, so that states should also be a part of this. So this is the purpose, to divide the power. Now, to understand federalism, though, we need to kind of understand it in context. And that means understanding that federalism is one of three major types of governmental arrangements that you can have. There's basically three different ways you can arrange power. You can have a federal distribution of power where governmental types share it. You can have a unitary form of government where one part of the government has all the power, or you can have a confederal where the subparts have all the power. And this is a case where a picture will paint 1,000 words for us. And let's start with a confederal system. In a confederal system, power is flowing in one direction. The units have all of it, and they get to give up what they want to a national government, no more, no less. Examples of this would have been the Articles of Confederation, or things like the United Nations or the European Union, right? Member states give the power to the central government such that they want to, and if and when they decide they don't want to do it anymore, whatever, they get to cut it off, because the power resides with the states, and that's a confederal form of government. Now, the second form of a government that we could have is a unitary form of government. And in a unitary form of government, power rests solely with the national government, and it flows in one direction, if it does at all, to sub-constituencies. A great example of this form of government is the United Kingdom, right? Parliament has all the power. There are local forms of government, but they only have power to the extent, that Parliament has given them power. And at any time, Parliament could take back that power. Now, we actually have a unitary form of government in one area in the United States, and that's in the relationship between states and counties and cities and other smaller forms of government, right? So inside of Florida, for instance, if Florida decided, hey, look, we don't want to have the Lucia County, we're going to redo the way counties are going to work, they could take away that power and redo it, because it's entirely up to the Florida legislature to make that decision. That's a unitary form of government, just another example. Now, at the big level, the American federal level, and that's what we're interested in here in this class, we share power. And in the federal system, power is shared between the national government and state governments. So Florida and Ohio and whoever, they will end up sharing power with the national or the federal government. Now, it's all well and good to say, okay, federal government. But how should we then distribute power, right? So imagine, for instance, in this class, if I said, look, so-and-so, one of the students in the class, this is just too much for me to do. I'm going to have them, share in the power of this class. And you're like, okay, but what does that mean? We say, we're going to share power, 50-50. He's going to get half the power and I'm going to get half the power. Now, most of you at this point are going to go things like, well, wait a second. Does that mean he's going to grade the papers? Does that mean he's going to look at the quizzes? Does that mean he's going to, go over what specifically does he get? How are we going to share it, right? It's the question that every sibling asks, right, when you get the new toy or the candy or whatever. Okay, where does the line get drawn? And there's a couple of different ways that this could be, right? You could be sharing power and have the states be the most important units. Or you could be sharing power and have the national government have the majority of it. Right? Both of these would be equally valid forms of federalism. So this is a huge question mark, and it's actually one that has never ultimately been completely settled in the American political system. Early on, right, before the Constitution was even finished, there's a couple of big points of view about how this should work out. One comes from Alexander Hamilton and others who end up being eventually the Federalists, who argue that the national government needs to be more unitary in form. And there's others who are going to argue, no, we still need to keep the strong sovereign states of the Articles of Confederation, like George Clinton, the governor of New York. And this is going to end up leading, after the ratification of the Constitution, after that compromise, into two competing camps about the interpretation of and the trajectory of federalism in the American Constitution, the American political system. And those two are going to be nationalists and state rightists. Nationalists will argue that we need a government that tends towards the unitary form, where the federal government has the preponderance of power. And they're going to point to a couple of really important things. They're going to say, look, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress has all powers necessary and proper for carrying out all these other things. So clearly we wanted an elastic, expansive Congress. We wanted a powerful national government. They're going to point to things like Article 4 of the Constitution that says that the Constitution and national laws can trump other things, right? This kind of trump card. And again, this means, says the nationalist, that the federal government should be the more powerful in the relationship between the national government and state governments. Now, the second view that emerges is the states' rights view, and it argues no, that we actually have dual sovereignty, meaning that states should be equal to the national government in power. And they're going to say, who ratified the Constitution? States. Who sent delegates to determine how there would be a new Constitution? States, right? The whole of the Constitution is about states creating a compact, and therefore states should be supreme. And quite frankly, this is a debate that continues to this day, right? Should states have the ability to decide about marijuana or about gay rights or pick a number of issues, or should there be a national standard, right? And this is a battle that continues. It hasn't ended. We talked earlier in an earlier mini lecture about the trajectory of American politics, and this is one of this ebb and flow of who should dominate. Now, that still doesn't ultimately answer for our purposes who decides, right? So, where do these powers come from? The answer is that the national government has a number of power sources. The biggest being the expressed powers found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which we've already talked about. Those are the things the national government can do and states can't do. National government can create money. State governments cannot create money. There's another set of powers, though, that Congress will get, and we call these implied powers. And remember we talked in the Constitution about that last phrase, the necessary and proper clause. There was a couple of different views about what the necessary and proper clause meant. But at a minimum, before we get into the details of that, we need to know that the powers that Congress derives from it, saying that we get this power because it's necessary and proper to carrying some other power into execution, we call these implied powers. You can't find them per se in the Constitution, but they're derived from that last clause in Article 1, Section 8. And these are going to be the big powers for the national government. And this will expand significantly as time goes on, what will be considered necessary or proper. Next, what about the state governments? Well, state governments, they get a grant of 10th Amendment power. 10th Amendment says that all the powers that aren't given to the national government are reserved to the states and to the people. And we then therefore call these oftentimes reserved powers, or sometimes also called police powers, because oftentimes lots of these have to do with policing. And there's a number of really big ones, right? Running elections, states determine this. Regulating intra-state commerce, meaning commerce that takes place entirely inside of your state. The protection of health and safety, state. Now, there are also going to be some powers that are what we call concurrent powers. And these are powers shared by the states and the federal government. And these include things like the power to tax or to enforce laws. Taxing being the biggest one, right? Here in Florida, at least right now, we don't have an income tax. But just because your state has an income tax doesn't mean you get to send a letter to the national government or the IRS saying, you know what, I've already paid my Kentucky taxes. I'm not going to have to, pay. I'm not going to pay any income tax to you. No, this is a concurrent power. Powers that go to both. Now, over time, in this relationship of which of these branches is going to have more power, the national government has slowly but surely increased in power. And we're going to take a look at some of these eras that have marked this trajectory of power increasing for the national government. And we're going to start with the first big era of shift, which is the Progressive Era, 1896 to 1913. In the Progressive Era, the Supreme Court will begin to allow the national government the authority to regulate many areas of commerce that it had not allowed before. Food safety, medicine, clothing, the control and breakup of industries such as oil and railroads and utilities. And it's really going to be Theodore Roosevelt who's going to begin this process of the trust busting and the idea and this progressive era that government can be a positive force for good. And a lot of this is going to come from expanded interstate commerce powers for Congress. One of the powers found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is the Interstate Commerce Clause, which says that Congress gets to regulate things that affect the trade between states. And this is going to be interpreted much more broadly during the Progressive Era and increase the power of the national government. The second era, the New Deal era, which is going to last from 1933 to 1952, in this era, and we've already kind of talked about this in the presidency section during FDR, when overwhelming Democratic majorities are going to come into power in 1932, and they are going to push for new power for the federal government. Bureaus to regulate the activities of banks and public employees, airlines, railroads, unions, and utilities will begin. It's going to create, as we already noted in the presidency section, the largest entitlement program, Social Security, in history, and to grow the national government in unprecedented sizes. And so by the end of the era, the federal budget will end up being 14.5 times larger than it had been in 1932. So by the time we get to the 1950s, this is a huge increase. Oops, forgot a little D there. There we go. The next era, the era of the Great Society, which is going to last from the 60s into the 70s, is going to see state governments be working with federal governments. And it's going to be with Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, where they're going to use the power of the national government to look at a variety of social issues and push in those areas. Now, most recently, we've seen some changes. And I would say that one of the changes that we're seeing happening, and we don't really know all of the ramifications of it, have been things like the Affordable Health Care Act. The idea that the federal government is going to now have mandates and penalties on individuals. And I think that's going to be something that continues to evolve. What will this era of society be? I'm not particularly sure. But let's pause here, and we'll come back next time, and we're going to be entering into our next section. We're going to start taking a look at the institutions of government. We're going to take a look at Congress first, then we're going to move into the presidency, and then we're going to move into the Supreme Court.